Welcome to this special edition of Belief Busters, in which we look at the masks and the roles that men have bought into, believing that that's who they must be. I'm hoping by the end of this series, you have given yourself permission to change those beliefs, to challenge those false beliefs, and step into the power of who you are truly meant to be. Welcome to Belief Busters. Today, I've invited these gentlemen to be my guests on this series of episodes that I've cheekily named, Are You a Real Man? Yes, I said cheekily, because what constitutes a real man? Is there such a thing? Are real men only the stereotypical male jock that is celebrated across our culture? Are there different types of masculinity? Are there differences in the perception of masculinity from one generation to another, or from one culture, from one state, from one country to another? Are there differences in masculinity from the cisgender to the non-binary? So, all right, are you ready for this? This is going to be interesting. Let me introduce my guests. First, we have Di Manuel. He lives in Vancouver. He is a certified lifestyle mentor and executive performance coach. His passion is to engage and challenge people in living healthy, more active lifestyles. Di believes that with the increasing obesity rates and lack of focus and education on preventative medicine, our country is facing a health epidemic. He sees the solution as one that starts with parents modeling a healthy, active lifestyle for their children to follow. Welcome, Di.
Hello. Such an honor to be here. This is so cool. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us. Next, we have Jay Pryor, and he identifies, or they identify as non-binary, Gen X, lives in Lawrence, Kansas. Jay is a speaker, executive coach, and facilitator of corporate trainings and workshops around the globe. They are the author of the acclaimed book, Lean Inside, 7 Steps to Personal Power, a practical guide to transformation for women, and co-hosts the podcast, Doing the Work with Jay and Becca. Yes, I have to inflect. I'm sorry. And Jay and Becca are devoted to awakening people to their own power to transform their lives. Jay is an LGBTQ advocate and educator for inclusivity and gender consciousness. Welcome, Jay.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. And Jay and we've known each other for quite a while. And I've read his book. It's a fabulous book. So if you do get a chance to read it, it's worth the read. It's a worthwhile read.
Thank you.
All right. And who do we have left? Is there someone left? Yes. This is my hubby, Graham Taylor Jones. Identifies as a male in Gen X generation. Graham is currently living full-time in an RV whilst working remotely. He's a computer geeky guy, and he has on his bio, he loves supporting his wife's ministry and outreach. Aw, I think he did that on purpose. He is an engineer who's also creative and works at integrating both sides of the brain, the logical side and the artistic. He plays several musical instruments and is a songwriter. He mentors friends and colleagues in technical skills, as well as how to navigate emotional situations with tact and diplomacy. Graham is committed to exploring spiritual growth, modeling authentic behaviors, and showing others that it is okay to be vulnerable as well as confident in one's abilities. Welcome, Graham.
Thank you.
All right, gentlemen, are you ready for the first question?
Yes.
All right, I gotta bring it on. All right, I like it. So, what were some of the indoctrinated earliest beliefs you learned about what constituted being a man? Who wants to take that?
You want to do alphabetical?
Well, are you going
I guess that
first
means
then?
I'll go first.
Jay before Jay.
Hi, Di.
Well, I think many, I won't say all, but I know in my own situation, my father was the first real male role model that I had. And he learned very well from his family early on that non-emoting was a standard.
Mhm.
And I remember him even retelling to me uh, that, he grew up and there was very little personal contact. And in a way, he had four older siblings, but his next in age was his brother, who was 10 years older than him. So he had four older siblings, of which there's a 10-year gap. So he was considered the oops, as he was often referred to. But they loved him nonetheless. And my grandmother, Grandma Grace, she was a wonderful woman. But this non-emoting, he was born in 1944. It was sort of he tried to explain to me it was sort of the norm. But I also remember some of the things that I would model was how he would interact with my mom. They eventually divorced, and he remarried as did my mother. And I remember some of their interactions as a young child, even up to about age 10, when they finally went their separate ways and decided to separate and ultimately divorce. And my dad's way of dealing with conflict was turn and run. He was very passive aggressive. He wouldn't raise his voice. He wouldn't really even show any emotion. He was rather stoic, but he would just disappear. He would ghost. And that was his method for dealing with conflict. And so I modeled that. I myself had that belief that this is how I would deal with conflict. Wouldn't raise my voice, wouldn't fight, would just back down and just swallow it. Whatever emotions I was feeling, just swallow it whole and deal with it. This created a lot of conflict in my own life, and I won't monopolize the conversation right now, but that was my earliest beliefs. And of course, I've spent a lot of years working through this stuff, a lot of support through professionals, counselors and psychologists, and also just social groups, really recognizing, trying to find the right groups of people to connect with, to learn from, the right mentors and the coaches. But it became very apparent to me almost 20 years ago, when I had my first daughter. She's now 17. And so just putting things into context here, as soon as I had my children, I realized, I can't deal with life this way. I need to learn a new way of coping, because it was creating a lot of struggles for myself, especially alcohol and drug use was a norm for dealing with some of these emotions that were coming up, and a way to mask things. And as my children were aging, and as my wife and I were trying to really have a thriving relationship, I realized I was the one that was preventing that. And so it was just recognizing some of these beliefs were really limiting me in many facets. And so, yeah, that was my earliest introduction to what's it mean to be a man. Well, I just modeled my dad, and he was a great man. And I know he loved me very dearly. He passed away 3 years ago from pancreatic cancer. And, there were certain things that we just never spoke about, but we're okay with that. And that's something I have to live with, yeah, that was my early days.
Thank you. Thank you for the vulnerability. Appreciate that. Jay, what about you?
Well, I think it's first of all important to have so people understand that I was born female, or that I was assigned female at birth. So I wasn't, and I was born in 1966 in a small town in Kansas. So you might say that was 1946, given where people came from perspective wise. So I talk about this in the show that I wrote. I call it classically trained, how we were classically trained in the way we were raised. So I was basically classically trained female, but I always wanted to be part of boys' games, men's games. And for me, earning my way onto the football field and earning my way into games with boys, the first thing I learned was, in order to be a guy, you have to be tough. And you have to be willing to take a punch, and you have to be, tough enough to stay in there and keep playing, especially if you're a girl, because obviously I wasn't supposed to be there. So for me, I had to be extra tough. I got hit extra hard. And, I just had to learn that that's how it is. If you're a dude and you want to be able to hang with guys, then you got to be able to be a little tough. And so for me, as a young girl, for example, I was a pretty big tomboy, but I really did my best to be as tough as possible and, learn to fight and, things like that just were like, just the way of the world and the world of being able to earn your way into the boy circle.
Mm-hmm. So do boys cry? Do real men cry?
No, not
Not
usually.
enough.
I mean, there's no crying in football. I mean, you definitely cry because you get hurt, and we fought each other in ways that would really hurt each other sometimes. So definitely guys would cry, but you would also get picked on if you cried. So,
Mm-hmm.
whatever, stuff like that. So the whole non-emoting thing I would completely concur with. But also that, yeah, you're definitely don't want to show a weakness or vulnerability.
Okay, thank you. What about you, Graham?
For me, there's multiple aspects where I grew up in a very religious family. So my view of masculinity was from the Bible. I was also in a family where my dad was the main breadwinner. So that was another aspect of it. I also had quite a few extended circle of very practical men who would always be building things, creating things, fixing things. And so I had this idea that men had to be competent and doing. And so I learned that. And I'm very, very grateful for that. On the religious side, there was something that Di said about conflict. I think I went to the point of, I can't fight the system. The system or the framework, the religious ideology is so strong that I have to get round it. My siblings, on the other hand, were prepared to fight and say, this is not who we are. But for me, it was very, okay, how do I navigate this thing to get round it? On the breadwinning side, my father gave me glimpses of a model that I'm appreciative of. So, for instance, when he lost his very important job on a career path, he took some pretty lowly jobs to make ends meet for us. He was a debt collector at one point, and he would go on a Sunday and pick up £5 or $5 just to keep food on the table. And so there's a glimpse of he was committed enough to us to be willing to do whatever it took. And also I have an abiding memory of my father where he apologized to me. And he apologized to me because he was sorry that he'd done me wrong. And that to me was very powerful. And that was a model for how I want to live in the world. So I had this, men and women should never mix, combined with man should be the breadwinner and willing to do whatever it took. Men had to be competent at fixing stuff. And yet here was this apology.
Thank you. Those beliefs that we carry is formed in our childhood, with our family of origin. And we believe what we've seen. We believe what was told to us. We believe how they defined us, and those are the beliefs that so many of us still walk around with. Those beliefs, they aren't even ours. They're not mine. What I really love about the work that we're doing on this podcast is to reprogram ourselves, because let's face it, that indoctrination from childhood is a programming. And now here as adults, we can make the choice of what programming systems we install or deactivate or dump, right? So this is why I love this work. So with that in mind, what was your process to really take stock that some of these beliefs didn't make sense? They may not be yours. They may be blocking your relationships, blocking how you want to outpicture in the world. And then how did you create new beliefs? Jay, do you mind if I start with you?
No, not at all. I was just trying to figure out where I fit in that world. I've always been somebody who identified as either, we didn't have the words non-binary or gender non-conforming back when I transitioned, but I was very, 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 very clear that I went on testosterone with zero intention to become a man. Like I did not have that want or desire or ever to be a man. So I didn't on purpose like model myself after men, but there also wasn't anybody else for me to look at in terms of who was interacting with other women. Because I was a young lesbian, I often looked to guys or TV shows. I often say I watched way too many Harrison Ford movies around how to be with women. So it was when I came out as a young lesbian and had feminists, get a hold of me that basically, were like, whoa, hold up, think about how you're moving in women's spaces. Because, then when I came out, I was in women only spaces all the time. And so I had to really look at then how do I take up space? How do I move? Those kind of things. So I initially started unpacking that stuff as a feminist, and then didn't think about it again until I went on testosterone. And then when I went on testosterone, the world started treating me so differently that for me in and of itself was such a shock to my system. And I'm embarrassed to say it was a shock, because it feels like I should have known. That was, you think you should know that. But I didn't. And I was very shocked. And so it's interesting because I was on testosterone for 18 years. And over time, I think, and I talk about this a lot, where I feel like the more you're in water that you swim in, the more you forget you're swimming in that water. And so after 18 years being on testosterone, the thing for me that I started to get to was subconsciously, without even knowing it, I was starting to buy into my own privilege in terms of just stopping fighting it as much. So it used to be that when I'd be in a crowd of heterosexual people and men are sitting around and women are just jumping up to serve them all, I would jump up and stir, I would get in there with the women like I'm not going to sit around and let women serve me. What I mean? So I noticed after a while, it's so exhausting to keep up that. Like the world is so binary and just nobody cares and everybody's just buying into it, that I definitely found myself like being like, oh, it's fine. Then I had a 180. I went off testosterone like a couple of years ago and I got my woman brain back. And when my woman brain came back, it was like, what? And so that has made me way more conscious that I get treated as a white man with privilege, and my brain is completely not pickled in testosterone anymore. So I have a very clear lens. And so for me now, it's always about like just doing my best to dismantle anything I can consciously see. And part of that is being a non-binary human and training and teaching people to actually act like I exist, because, our world is so binary. Even today, like when you address us, you say gentleman. I don't identify as a gentleman. Right. I don't identify as a man. So, and I exist. So I try to train people to use words like, hey, folks and people. So I get to exist in that framework. Right. So I spent a lot of time doing that. And I'm always in this conversation because when I transitioned and the world started treating me a particular way, a lot of the things that I learned about how men get treated were very sad to me. It was like, whoo,
say more. What's sad?
I talk about this. I do a One Human show, and I'll talk about this at the end of the night. But one of the things I talk about in the show is when I first started testosterone, and I had a sister-in-law who was dying of cancer. And I went home as soon as she was in hospice. She had hospice, and that she's just got 3 days to live or whatever. So my sisters and I came home. And we went back to our hometown, because that's what women do in times like that, right? We come back, we make the meals, we take care of the kids, we help clean the house, we do all that stuff, right? So I'm back there with my sisters, we're doing all that stuff. But then she dies, and all 6 of her children, plus my brother, are in saying goodbye to her. And they come out of that room one by one. And as they do, me and my 2 sisters are the ones there catching those children who just lost their mom and holding them, right? And I remember my 6'2" nephew falling into my 5-foot arms and thinking to myself, in this moment, am I his Aunt Janet or his Uncle Jay? Like I was in a real, and I know when I say this in the show, I'm his Aunt Janet, because if I was born with a penis, I wouldn't be here. None of my brothers were there. None of my brothers even considered coming early. They came for the funeral. They were there to support their brother the way they do that. But I did that. When you're trained into being classically trained female. You go. You just go. But throughout history, we have excluded men from those conversations in those spaces. So look what they missed out on.
Mm.
I have this juicy experience with my nieces and nephews. That's a bond we'll have forever, right? That my brothers didn't even get invited to. And it's not like they weren't, not even like we were invited, because we just did it on our own and came, because that's, again, what women do. You get my point. I mean, your brother's dying. You're not going to be like, I'm going to stay home, wait for the funeral. No.
Right.
Women don't do that. We have to go take care of them and nurture them and be there for the kids, right? So I just find it fascinating. Things like that. Things like always people expecting me to know where we were going and what we were doing. The first time I got in a cab with 4 women, and the cab driver literally refused to speak to any of them and only talked to me the whole time, I was mind blown. Like, things like that all the time that you don't know until you don't know that the world treats men that way until the world starts treating you that way. It's eye-opening, right? So I'm very sad about a lot of the things we do to little boys, and the exclusion that we give them. I say early on there's that documentary called The Mask That We Wear on Netflix, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
They talk about, like, in junior high, beyond junior high, men and boys don't really get to touch each other that much, because it has to turn into high fives or wrestling, because that's the only way men are allowed to be physical with one another. Things like that, like me touching people and then having men be like, looking at me like, what the hell's wrong with you? And I forget that I was, it's a man face that's happening, right? I'm forgetting that I used to be a woman. I could touch anybody anytime I wanted, right? Women can reach over and touch a guy in a heartbeat, but if another guy does that, then homophobia everywhere. It's things like that you just don't even think about until you're in that situation. So
Thank you, Jay. I really appreciate it. And I was very deliberate in inviting you to this conversation, because it is a conversation that we need to open up and say, we have these labels that we try to force on everyone, regardless of where they are.
Right.
So thank you. Thank you for your vulnerability as well.
Sure.
Di, do you want to jump in? How are you feeling about this?
Well, I want to acknowledge Jay. I really appreciate that. It's amazing how it's just a perspective I haven't taken the time to really sit with and think about. And I just want to say that what you just shared was very powerful, and it's really opened my eyes, but also my mind to a lot of things. And because also my 17-year-old, she's quite the activist, so she's, with everything that's going on in the world today, she's out there, and she's very vocal, and she's just always charging forward for everyone, And I know she's brought up this conversation before, but I was struggling with trying to understand. And the way you just shared, I'm actually excited to have a conversation with her and share this conversation that you just shared with her as well. So I just wanted to acknowledge you. Thank you for that.
I appreciate that.
Very powerful. Yeah. For myself, I'm a slow learner. I was definitely challenged. I never got into sports, even though that was the traditional things. I grew up in a small hockey town, just outside of Toronto. And, if you didn't play hockey, what did you do? That was the cool kids. All the guys are playing sports. And I was morbidly obese as a teenager. And because of that, I was also a late bloomer with puberty, because that was stunted based on just my inactivity and the way I nourished myself, or lack thereof. And so I struggled a lot, and then went through my own personal changes later. But I found myself always wanting to try to be something that I wasn't. And particularly, I got into drinking, after I started making these transformations, because all of a sudden other kids started to take note of me. It was like, oh, wow, Di, you're looking very different. A lot of people that were in my grade, being in a small town, they always thought of me as the bigger kid, no matter what. Even once I lost the weight and started to adopt a more healthy lifestyle, the girls in my own grade wouldn't even take note of me. because I was like always in the friend zone. And so I had to date up, which was kind of interesting in itself. But also I was still quite immature. The only saving grace was that my mom raised us. I spent the majority of my time with my mom, and some of the conversations that I had with my mom, some people think that maybe I grew up a little bit too quickly with some of the content. I was easily a shoulder for my mom to cry on at times. And some of the conversations we shared were rather deep. And to think about it, when I think back on it, I'm like, whoa, that was, especially her when she was starting to get into dating again. And sometimes these guys would mistreat her, and just, being part of that conversation at 14, 15 years old, it was like, there's a lot to take in, but I wanted to be there for my mom. I wanted to support her. And I loved her very deeply. And I still do to today. We still have a great relationship. And because of that, and some of what she instilled in me, I found it always in conflict, especially when I was trying to connect with men, especially the men's men, like the guys want to go to the pub. They want to connect there. They want to watch sports, like all this stuff that I was believing that I should too be doing. And I never enjoyed it. And later on in life, I just realized one of the easiest ways to connect with guys was, well, let's go have some drinks. We have to be very misogynist. We have to try to pick up girls. And this is my early 20s to mid 20s. And even then I started getting very serious with my wife, and we got married, we started having kids young, but I was still dealing with this sort of dichotomy of trying to fit in with these men because I'm in the fitness industry as well for 25 years, and it's pretty biased, and it has a lot of stereotypes, which, we would think they're almost cliches now, but it's a very male-dominated industry, and it's very sexist at times. And I found myself wanting to connect. So you find yourself saying certain comments, which, I know if my mom was there, she would have slapped me upside the head. There's no way she would have accepted it. And I always felt really icky about it. And I recall, I started to have a reputation from people, that, hey, you go to a big conference, an industry show, everybody would want to hang out with me in the night. They would always say, where are you going tonight, Di? And they would call me Billy White Shoes. I would often wear white shoes. And so I had this nickname, and it was just this persona. And I found myself wanting to live into that, because all of a sudden it was like everybody wanted to hang out. Fun guy Di, And then I started having daughters. I have 2 daughters now. And I started realizing that I felt really empty on the inside. And so obviously I doubled down on my career. I really focused on the company I was building at the time, and looking for accolades, looking to establish myself as the dude, right? Based on what I believe to be successful. And I chased that. And meanwhile, still drinking started to ramp up. I still wanted to be accepted with this certain crew. And at all times, I just felt like I was living 2 lives. And it eventually got to a point where everything came tumbling down. And this is just over 10 years ago. And I haven't had a drink since then. And, everything has gotten a lot better, but it took a lot of effort, took a lot of support. But also, I had to get to a point where I had to realize that the people I was associating with were not supportive at all. In fact, as soon as I made an announcement that I was going to go 1 year without alcohol, just to show myself that I could, to focus on making some shifts in my life, to try to get healthy. And all of a sudden, there was a bunch of guys that I knew that I thought were really good friends. And I stopped getting invited places. They didn't know how to interact. I remember going to watch the UFC once with them at the local bar, and they're like, "Well, have a drink." And I'm like, "Well, no, I'm not drinking." And like, why? And just the pushback, like they just couldn't accept it. And I was like, what is going on here? This is crazy. And I started to realize that, if you can't change your friends, just change your friends. And it ultimately is what happened. I started realizing I need to find new association. But I also needed support, because there was a lot of emotional baggage there, a lot of things that I was feeling, a lot of guilt and shame around. And so that's where I sought out third-party support as well. But everything started when my wife asked me a question one day after an all-night bender, me doing some things I'm very embarrassed to admit I even did. But it was on par with the guy that I would be when I would drink. And I remember just asking, like, are you being the type of man that you'd want to marry your daughters? And that
Boy,
question, it was a booyah moment. It was like, what? It was like holding the mirror up there and just having to really stare myself down and reflect on that question. And I realized at that moment, I had a guy showed up on my doorstep wanting to come in and meet my daughters at that time. If it was a person like me, who I was before, there's no way I would have let him across the threshold. You know, I'm like, no way, you're not getting in here. Yet that's who I was. And so, off I went to doing a lot of work. And really the last 5 years are where I've had the most breakthroughs, I like to think, where I've really started to get more connected with both the feminine and the masculine and really figure out, moving those aside, those types, if you will, just being me, being the guy that I'm happy with being the dad that I want to be, being the husband I want to be, being the friend, the father, the community leader. And what does that even mean? And started attending men's groups. And in fact, when I was in Bali, there wasn't that many men's circles to connect with unless I wanted to drive for about 40 minutes. And so I started one and just started inviting guys. Hey, let's meet on Monday nights and have dinner together. It was Mentorship Monday, capital MEN. And what was really interesting was these guys that were all on a similar journey. They all recognized there was something not connecting. There was things that they wanted to share, but they didn't feel they had a space to share it. And just speaking of my own perspective on this, I know me being vulnerable with another man was not something I ever did. Now, again, we can think back to my father and the way that his brothers and the way my cousin, just this interaction was really this non-emoting, you just suck it up, buttercup, and you deal with it. And so I knew there was something there, but I always thought it was a weakness. I thought, they're going to use this against me. I can't tell them how I'm feeling right now because this is it's going to hold me back. I'm going to be judged. And it's amazing how the play plays out in our minds. And but all of a sudden I realized that there was a lot of men like this. And we had guys from 20 years old up to 70, all coming together on Monday nights to have dinner. And we had 20, 25 guys. It was just incredible. And I realized I'm not alone. Mm-hmm. That, everything that I believed to be true was absolutely false. I made it true because I thought it was true, but I realized that there's a lot of these walls that can be broken down as soon as you create a space where people feel safe, feel connected, feel like they can be vulnerable, and realize that it's a safe place to do so, and they're not going to be judged, and nothing's going to be held against them. And so it's been an eye-opener for me, and we've continued it. Even we're doing on Zooms. We got one in Bali, we got a guy in Australia, we've got a guy in Thailand, one in Paris, one in Vancouver now, one in Toronto. So we got these little pockets, these little groups popping up. It's just been amazing. And Zoom, this, COVID aside, I didn't see it as something that would hold us back from connecting. And in fact, we've actually had more men coming to us right now. And I think it's probably because of the isolation aspect. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of loneliness right now. Mm-hmm. But loneliness is a choice, right? It really is. And so that's, I'm still on the journey. I like to think it's going to be a long journey. It's going to be a lifelong journey, but I'm learning. And I think that's the thing I want to just try to instill in others is, learn from the Japanese. I don't know if you're familiar with wabi-sabi. Wabi-sabi? Mm-hmm. The art of imperfection, right? Seeing the beauty in things that aren't perfect. And it took me a long time to figure that one out because I used to be a bit of a perfectionist, very much type A. So I relate to what you were saying about the editing of podcasts. My old self, oh my goodness, I'd be there for days until I thought it was perfect. But, I've learned how to give myself grace and not be so critical. And that was one of the first things I needed to really start to heal. So that's a bit of a snapshot on the last 25 some odd years.
Awesome. Thank you. Appreciate that.
Thank you. Yeah.
Graham, what about you? What was your process?
What Di said about the seeing the beauty, the imperfection, that's the key to a good marriage, I believe. But for me, I'm a hot stove and a runaway learner. So if something hurts me enough, I will assess the belief and then change it. The other aspect is if I remove myself from the situation, as you can probably tell from my accent, I flew 4,000 miles away from my childhood home, basically. Because of that, I was forced to have new beliefs because here I am in a different culture, in a different country, in a different way of working. So I now had to navigate it. So my beliefs no longer held. And also, I've been around people who have been modeling beliefs that I like. So it's like, oh, that looks an interesting one. Maybe that'll serve me better. So I think those particular three sides have helped me work out, okay, is this belief working for me? And I've still got quite a few more to do as well.
What made you think that you needed to be 4,000 miles away for you to be able to shift your beliefs?
I think for me, it's very similar to the fighting of the system. Like if you at that time, I didn't have the strength to say, this is what I need to do, or this piece is not okay. So it became easier for me if I sort of snapped the elastic band, if I cut the tie, moved away, and then I was able to freely come up with a new beliefs. I think had I stayed local, I think it would have probably taken me an extra 20 years to get to the point where I would say, this piece isn't working for me, this is what I want.
Thank you for joining us on Belief Busters. I hope this episode gives you permission to change your beliefs about yourself, about the world, and others. You can reach me at beliefbusterspodcast.org. Also, I've written a book, Turning Your Why into Why Not, which gives you practical steps and solutions looking at your belief systems, to honoring them, and those that no longer serve you, giving you ways in creating new ones, allowing you to thrive. See you on the flip side.